There are manuscripts older than empires that claim something unsettling. The power you've been praying for was never outside you. It was buried beneath your own thinking, waiting for recognition, not permission. In this journey, you will uncover the forbidden code hidden across ancient teachings, from hermetic scrolls to mystical gospels, that reveals how manifestation truly works. Not as wishful thinking, but as a precise inner mechanism, and the final truth may challenge everything you've been told about effort, faith, and control. Chapter 1: The Divine Spark Within. Gnostic Insight. There are teachings so old they were never meant to be widely understood, only discovered. Among them lies a quiet but unsettling idea preserved within the currents of Gnosticism, that something divine was not placed above you, but within you, not as a symbol, not as poetry, but as a living fragment of creative intelligence, waiting to be recognized, not lost, only hidden. In the scattered texts associated with this tradition, especially echoes found in works like the Gospel of Thomas, there is a recurring message: the kingdom is inside of you. This statement has been softened over centuries, turned into metaphor, ritual, or belief. But originally, it pointed to something far more direct: that the source of creation is not separate from the observer, but embedded within consciousness itself. This is not a comforting idea. It is a demanding one, because if the source is within, then responsibility is as well. A story survives in fragments from an early desert sect. A teacher sitting before a group of seekers who had spent years searching for truth across lands and temples. They asked him, "Where do we go next to find what we are seeking?" The teacher did not answer immediately. He simply pointed to his chest and said, "You have never left." The room fell silent, because in that moment their entire journey was revealed as misdirected, not useless but incomplete. They had searched everywhere except the one place they had been avoiding. Their own awareness, seeking outward, delays discovery. This is the central tension of the human condition. The instinct is to look outward, to circumstances, to people, to systems, for the source of change. And yet, across multiple ancient traditions, the same insight appears again and again. The external world is not the origin of experience. It is the reflection of an inner orientation, not imposed, reflected. Consider a man who lived with a constant sense of limitation. Opportunities appeared around him, but he dismissed them before acting. Conversations arose, but he assumed rejection before speaking. Over time, his world seemed to confirm his belief. Nothing works out. Doors remain closed. But observe carefully, was this reality? Or was it interpretation shaping action? Because when he believed opportunities would fail, he hesitated. When he hesitated, he acted less. When he acted less, results diminished. And when results diminished, his belief felt confirmed. A closed loop, subtle, invisible, but powerful. The outer world appeared restrictive. But the pattern began within. This is where the Gnostic insight becomes practical rather than abstract. The divine spark is not some mystical ornament. It is the capacity to influence perception, interpretation, and response at the deepest level. Not control over everything, but participation in everything experienced. Awareness is creative. Another parable tells of a craftsman who was given a piece of raw stone and told that within it was a perfect sculpture. Confused, he asked how this could be true. The master replied, "It is already there. Your task is not to create it, but to remove what hides it. This is the nature of inner power. It is not added, it is uncovered. And what hides it is not ignorance alone, but conditioning. Patterns of thought repeated so often they appear natural. Interpretations accepted so early they feel like reality. Emotional responses reinforced until they become automatic, layer upon layer, until the original clarity is obscured, but not destroyed. This is why ancient teachings emphasize recognition over acquisition. You do not gain power in the way the modern mind imagines. You become aware of what has always been operating beneath your attention. Recognition changes everything. In psychological terms, this aligns with a simple but often overlooked principle. The brain does not respond only to reality, it responds to perceived reality, and perception is shaped internally. The way you interpret a situation determines your emotional state. Your emotional state determines your behavior. Your behavior shapes your outcomes. A chain reaction, break it at the level of awareness, and the entire sequence shifts. This is why the idea of the divine spark is both empowering and uncomfortable, because it removes the illusion of complete external control. It suggests that while you cannot dictate every event, you are never completely separate from how those events are experienced and responded to. You are not powerless, but you are also not exempt from responsibility. There is a quiet moment that arrives when this understanding deepens, not intellectually but experientially. It often happens in stillness, in observation, in the recognition that a reaction you once believed was automatic is actually optional, that a thought you once accepted can be questioned, that a pattern you once repeated can be interrupted. And in that moment, something subtle returns: authority, not over the world, but within your participation in it. This is the beginning, not the end. Because once you recognize that something within you is shaping how reality is experienced, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is this inner mechanism, and how does it operate? For that we move deeper, not into belief, but into structure. Chapter 2, the first principle. The all is mind. There is a line preserved within the Kybalion that has unsettled thinkers for generations. The all is mind, the universe is mental. It is often repeated, rarely understood, and almost never examined with the depth it requires, because if this principle is taken seriously, it changes the foundation of how reality itself is perceived. Reality is not only physical, it is interpreted. At first this idea seems abstract. After all, the world appears solid, external, independent. Objects exist whether you think about them or not. Events unfold regardless of your opinion. So how can reality be mental? The answer lies not in denying the external world, but in recognizing that experience of that world is always mediated through consciousness. You never encounter reality directly, you encounter your perception of it. Consider something simple. Two people walk into the same room. One feels tension, discomfort, unease. The other feels calm, neutral, even curious. The environment is identical. The difference is not the room, it is the internal state interpreting it. Same world, different experience. This is not imagination, it is structure. The mind does not passively record reality, it actively organizes it, filtering information, prioritizing certain details, ignoring others, assigning meaning based on prior conditioning. What you notice is shaped by what you expect. What you expect is shaped by what you have repeatedly thought and believed. Perception is selective, and selection shapes experience. A well-known illustration from early philosophical teachings tells of a traveler who entered a city and asked a guard what the people there were like. The guard replied, "What were the people like where you came from?" The traveler answered, "Unkind, dishonest, difficult." The guard nodded. "You will find the same here." Later, another traveler asked the same question. When asked about his previous town, he said, "Kind, generous, welcoming." The guard smiled. "You will find the same here." The city did not change, the interpretation did. This is the Hermetic principle in motion, not mystical but observable. The mind does not create physical reality in the sense of instant material change, but it does shape the way reality is perceived, engaged with, and responded to. And that changes outcomes over time, because perception influences behavior. Behavior influences results. Results reinforce perception, a feedback loop. Most people live inside this loop without ever seeing it. They assume reality is happening to them, unaware that their interpretation is shaping how they move within it. And because they never examine the internal layer, they attempt to change outcomes externally, through effort, control, or force. But without shifting the internal pattern, the same results reappear in different forms. Barthes repeat. This is where the Hermetic idea becomes practical. If the universe is mental at the level of experience, then changing the quality of thought changes the quality of perception, and changing perception changes the direction of behavior, not instantly, but consistently. A man once struggled with constant frustration in his work. Every problem felt like obstruction. Every delay felt like failure. His reaction was immediate and habitual: irritation, resistance, tension. Over time, this state influenced his decisions. He rushed, overlooked details, created further complications. Then something small changed. He began to observe his reactions before acting on them, not to suppress them, but to see them. In that observation, he noticed a pattern. His interpretation of events was amplifying his stress more than the events themselves. When he began to reinterpret challenges as information rather than obstruction, his response shifted. He slowed down, adjusted his approach, reduced errors. Gradually, the environment seemed to change, not because circumstances disappeared, but because his interaction with them improved. Same conditions, different outcome. This is the subtle meaning behind the all is mind. It is not a claim that you control everything. It is a recognition that the layer through which you experience everything is internal, and that layer is not fixed. It can be refined, it can be trained, it can be understood, and once understood, it can be directed, not through force but through awareness. The danger, however, lies in oversimplification. Many take this principle and assume that positive thinking alone is enough, that repeating certain phrases or imagining certain outcomes will immediately reshape reality. This is where the teaching is misunderstood. Because the mind does not respond to occasional thought, it responds to consistent patterns. Survey thinking changes little. Deep patterns shape everything, which is why the work is not about pretending reality is different, but about gradually aligning perception with clarity rather than distortion. That takes time, attention, discipline, but it is possible. And once the internal structure begins to shift, something subtle happens. The world no longer feels entirely random. Patterns become visible, reactions become optional, responses become intentional. And what once felt like chaos begins to show structure. This is where the ancient teaching becomes practical knowledge, not something to believe, but something to observe directly in your own experience. So watch carefully. Notice how your thoughts shape your interpretation. Notice how your interpretation shapes your response. Notice how your response shapes your results, because within that sequence lies the mechanism. And once you see the mechanism, you begin to understand how reality is not just experienced, but quietly influenced from within. Chapter 3, The Inner Kingdom, Gospel of Thomas. There are truths so simple that the mind resists them, not because they are difficult to understand, but because they quietly overturn everything we have been taught to seek. One such truth appears in the ancient sayings preserved within the Gospel of Thomas. The kingdom is within you. For centuries, these words have been interpreted as comfort, poetry, or religious metaphor. Yet to the earliest mystics, they pointed towards something far more unsettling. They were not describing a distant heaven, they were describing an inner faculty, a hidden authority, a creative center of perception through which all experience is interpreted, shaped, and ultimately lived. This is why the phrase has endured. It carries a strange force, one that seems to awaken something familiar, as though it is reminding rather than informing, because somewhere beneath all conditioning, most people already suspect this is true. They sense that what governs the quality of life is not merely circumstance, but consciousness itself. And yet the search almost always begins outward. A person spends years believing peace will arrive through achievement. Another believes fulfillment will appear when the right relationship emerges. Another imagines confidence will be granted by recognition, money, status, or approval. The pattern is ancient. Human beings are taught to seek externally what can only be stabilized internally, and so they wander. A story preserved in early desert tradition tells of a young seeker who traveled across kingdoms searching for a hidden temple said to contain the wisdom of life itself. He crossed mountains, deserts, and ruined cities. He studied under scholars, priests, and ascetics. Decades passed. At last, old and exhausted, he arrived before a forgotten monastery and asked the elder monk where the temple could be found. The monk studied him quietly, then handed him a mirror. Confused, the seeker asked, "What does this mean?" The monk replied, "The temple was waiting for the one who stopped running long enough to enter. Then the kingdom was never elsewhere. It was obscured by movement. Stillness reveals. This is the essential meaning behind the inner kingdom. It is not a physical location, nor an emotional high, nor a mystical fantasy. It is the state of conscious awareness from which all thought, interpretation, and response arise. To discover it is not to acquire something new. It is to remember what has always been present beneath noise. This idea appears across traditions because it points to a universal psychological truth. The quality of external life is inseparable from the state of internal organization. A disordered inner world creates fragmented perception. Fragmented perception creates confused action, and confused action produces unstable outcomes. The reverse is equally true. When awareness becomes centered, perception clarifies. Action becomes intentional. Life begins to reflect coherence. This is creative authority, not domination over events, participation through alignment. Many misunderstand this principle because they imagine inner power as dramatic visions, revelations, extraordinary experiences. But often it appears quietly, a moment of pause before reacting. The recognition that a thought is only a thought, the ability to witness fear without immediately obeying it, these moments seem small. They are not. Each is an act of reclaiming authority from unconscious habit. A man once spent years trapped in resentment toward a colleague who had wronged him. Every morning he replayed the story. Every conversation was filtered through it. Even unrelated frustrations became connected to that old wound. His life slowly narrowed. He believed another person's actions had stolen his peace. Then, during a period of forced solitude after illness, he noticed something startling. The event itself had ended years earlier, yet he was recreating it daily through memory and interpretation. The prison remained only because he kept rebuilding it. That realization changed everything. He did not instantly become free of resentment, but he began to observe it rather than inhabit it. Over time, its power weakened. The external event remained part of history, but his relationship to it changed. And with that change, life opened again. This is the inner kingdom at work. The realization that between event and experience lies consciousness, and consciousness is not fixed. It can be cultivated, strengthened, refined. The ancients understood this deeply. That is why many schools of wisdom emphasized self-observation before doctrine, silence before speech, awareness before action. They knew that without mastery of the inner domain, all external striving becomes unstable. The person who rules circumstances, but not consciousness, remains internally fragmented. The person who governs awareness, however, carries order wherever they go. Order radiates outward. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is psychological law. When your inner state stabilizes, your decisions improve. When decisions improve, outcomes shift. When outcomes shift, life reflects the change, not because the universe suddenly grants favor, but because reality is always filtered through the quality of consciousness perceiving it. The kingdom is within, and this changes everything because it means the source of transformation is available now, not after conditions improve, not after approval is received, not after life finally becomes ideal. Now, in the next thought you question, in the next reaction you observe, in the next moment of stillness you choose, the doorway has never been locked, only overlooked. And once this inner authority is recognized, another ancient principle emerges to explain how it moves beyond awareness and begins shaping lived experience. A principle preserved in one of history's most mysterious texts, a sentence so brief it can be missed, yet so profound it may explain the mechanism itself. Chapter 4, The Mirror of Correspondence, Emerald Tablet. Among all ancient esoteric writings, few have inspired as much fascination as the Emerald Tablet. Attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, it contains a phrase repeated through centuries of mystical study. As above, so below, as within, so without. At first glance, sound poetic, elegant, mysterious. But beneath its simplicity lies one of the most precise descriptions of how inner states become lived reality. This is not metaphor. It is mechanism. The principle of correspondence suggests that patterns replicate across levels of existence. What is structured internally tends to express externally. What is cultivated in consciousness gradually appears in behavior, perception, relationships, and outcomes. Mortar architecture becomes outer experience. Consider a garden. If the soil is neglected, no amount of repainting the fence will change what grows there. You may decorate endlessly, but the harvest will always reveal the hidden condition beneath. The same is true of consciousness. Most people focus on external adjustments, changing jobs, environments, routines, even relationships, while leaving the deeper internal patterns untouched. And so the same difficulties reappear in new forms, different scenery, same structure. A woman once moved across 3 cities in search of a fresh start. In each place she initially felt renewed. New streets, new faces, new possibilities. Yet within months, familiar frustrations returned. Conflict in relationships, species dissatisfaction, a quiet sense of being trapped. She assumed the problem was circumstance, until one evening, while unpacking yet another apartment, she realized something unsettling. She had changed locations, but she had brought the same interpretations, expectations, fears, and unconscious reactions with her. The outer world reflected the inner continuity she had failed to notice. Wherever you go, you arrive. This is correspondence in motion. What remains unresolved within tends to reorganize itself externally until recognized not as punishment, as reflection. Ancient alchemists understood this principle through symbolic language. They spoke of transforming lead into gold, not merely as chemistry, but as consciousness. Lead represented dense, unconscious patterns. Gold represented refined awareness. The outer transformation symbolized inner transmutation. Chant within, see change without. This is why the deepest teachings of Hermetic philosophy emphasize self-mastery above all else. Because external control is fragile, inner coherence is generative. A person consumed by anxiety often unconsciously creates anxious conditions, not by mystical projection, but through subtle choices shaped by fear. They avoid opportunities, misread neutral signals as threats, rush decisions, withdraw prematurely. The internal pattern quietly engineers external confirmation. Then reality appears to validate the fear. The mirror reflects faithfully. Likewise, someone who has cultivated clarity tends to organize life differently. They notice opportunities others overlook, respond rather than react, interpret uncertainty as possibility rather than danger. Over time, life appears to favor them. But what changed was not fate, it was correspondence. The external simply reflected internal order. This truth can feel confronting because it asks for responsibility. It is easier to believe life happens randomly than to consider that many recurring patterns are mirrors of unseen inner structures. Yet this recognition is not blame. It is liberation, because if patterns are mirrored, they can be changed at the source. A story from late alchemical tradition tells of a student who spent years polishing a ceremonial mirror, believing it held magical power. He cleaned it obsessively, hoping one day it would reveal hidden truth. Finally, frustrated, he brought it to his master and asked why nothing appeared. The master looked into it and said, "The mirror has always reflected perfectly. It is your gaze that remains clouded." Then he handed it back. Clean the seer. The lesson was immediate. Reality does not distort itself. Perception distorts reality. Refine perception, and reflection changes. This is where correspondence becomes profoundly practical. It asks, what patterns dominate your inner life? What assumptions quietly guide your responses? What emotional states have become so familiar they feel natural? Because these are the templates reality is reflecting. Observe the internal blueprint, and if what is reflected externally feels chaotic, strained, repetitive, or limited, the invitation is not merely to fight the reflection, it is to examine the source. The modern world rarely teaches this. It teaches reaction, urgency, external optimization, fix the circumstance, control the environment, chase the result. But ancient wisdom points elsewhere. Begin within. Stabilize consciousness, clarify perception, align thought with truth rather than fear. Then allow correspondence to do what it always does. Reflect quietly, faithfully, inevitably. And when this begins to happen, something extraordinary becomes visible. You stop seeing reality as an opponent. You begin seeing it as feedback, a mirror, a living response to inner orientation. This changes how you meet every challenge. Every difficulty becomes information. Every repetition becomes instruction. Every experience becomes revelation. Because if the outer world reflects the inner, then every moment is showing you something about yourself. And once you learn to read the mirror, you no longer wander blindly through life asking why. You begin shaping the source, and when the source changes, the reflection must follow. Chapter 5. The Role of Belief. There is a quiet force operating beneath every thought you consciously choose. a deeper layer that does not argue, does not debate, and does not question. It simply accepts, organizes, and executes. This layer has been described in many ways across traditions, but in modern language it is often called the subconscious mind, a concept brought into popular awareness through thinkers like Joseph Murphy. And its nature is simple. It obeys what is repeated, not what is wished, not what is briefly imagined, but what is consistently believed. Belief is instruction. The subconscious does not distinguish between a carefully reasoned conclusion and a casually repeated assumption. It does not evaluate truth in the philosophical sense. It responds to familiarity. Whatever is impressed upon it repeatedly begins to feel real, and what feels real begins to guide perception and behavior. This is where most people misunderstand their own experience. They believe their beliefs are conclusions. In reality, many beliefs are repetitions. A man once grew up hearing a single phrase from those around him. Opportunities like that are not for people like us. It was not presented as doctrine. It was simply said, casually, repeatedly, over years. By the time he reached adulthood, he did not consciously remember the origin of the phrase, but its effect remained. When faced with opportunity, he hesitated. When invited into growth, he declined. When possibility, he doubted. And over time, his life appeared to confirm the belief he had never consciously chosen. Not because the world excluded him, but because his internal system filtered out participation. The belief shaped perception, perception shaped action, action shaped outcome, and outcome reinforced belief. A closed circuit. This is how the subconscious operates, quietly, consistently, without announcement. It does not need your awareness to function. In fact, it is most powerful when unnoticed. A gardener plants seeds without immediately seeing results. Days pass, weeks pass. Beneath the surface, unseen processes are unfolding. Roots form. Structures develop. Eventually something appears above ground, but by that time the outcome has already been determined by what was planted earlier. The mind works the same way. Beliefs are seeds, and the subconscious is the soil. It does not argue with the seed. It nurtures it. This is why ancient teachings emphasized vigilance over inner patterns. They understood that what is repeatedly impressed upon the inner world becomes the blueprint for outer experience. Not instantly, but inevitably. A woman once carried a quiet conviction that relationships lead to disappointment. She had experienced it early in life, and though she never spoke it directly, the belief remained active beneath her awareness. When she met someone kind, she anticipated change. When things went well, she waited for decline. When minor misunderstandings occurred, she interpreted them as signs of inevitable failure. Her responses became guarded. Her tone became cautious. Her openness diminished. And over time, the relationship strained, not because of the other person alone, but because her belief had shaped her participation. Eventually, the relationship ended, and her conclusion felt confirmed. This always happens, but what she did not see was the role her belief had played in guiding the process. This is not blame, it is mechanism. The subconscious does not sabotage. It executes patterns. If a belief is rooted in fear, it organizes perception and behavior around that fear. If a belief is rooted in possibility, it organizes around that possibility. In both cases, the process is the same. Only the content differs. This is why change at the level of behavior alone often fails. A person may attempt to act differently, more confident, more open, more decisive, but if the underlying belief remains unchanged, the old pattern eventually reasserts itself. Surfy effort cannot override deep instruction for long. the root must be addressed. This is where awareness becomes essential, because belief once seen can be questioned, and once questioned, it can be replaced, not through force, but through repetition of a new pattern, a deliberate one, a conscious one. The process is simple, but not easy. First, observe the recurring results in your life, then trace them back to the behaviors that produce them, then examine the assumptions guiding those behaviors. Within those assumptions, you will often find the belief. Once identified, it becomes possible to introduce a different instruction. Not once, but consistently, because the subconscious learns through repetition. A single affirmation changes little, a sustained pattern changes structure. This is where many misunderstand teachings about positive thinking. They imagine that briefly stating something desirable will override years of ingrained belief. It does not. The subconscious does not respond to occasional input. It responds to dominant patterns. Consistency reshapes. Over time, a new belief begins to feel familiar. What once seemed unrealistic becomes possible. What once triggered doubt begins to feel natural. And as this shift occurs internally, behavior follows, perception adjusts, choices evolve, outcomes begin to reflect the new pattern, not magically, systematically. This is the hidden role of belief. It is not a passive opinion, it is an active instruction. And once you understand this, a deeper question emerges, one that many ancient teachers hinted at but few explained directly. If belief is the instruction, what gives belief its power? Why do some ideas remain weak, while others take hold and shape reality so strongly? The answer lies not only in thought, but in something more immediate, more visceral, something that bypasses argument entirely: feeling. Chapter 6. Feeling as the secret key. There is a moment in human experience when thought alone is no longer enough. You can repeat an idea, you can analyze it, you can even intellectually accept it, and yet nothing changes because the deeper system has not been moved. It is only when an idea is felt, truly felt, that it begins to take root. This is the insight emphasized by Neville Goddard, who argued that the secret of manifestation is not in occasional thought, but in sustained emotional conviction. Feeling impresses reality, the mind may suggest, but emotion confirms. The subconscious, as described earlier, responds to repetition, but it responds more quickly and more powerfully to repetition combined with feeling. Emotion acts as a signal telling the system, this matters. And what matters is prioritized. Consider how quickly a deeply emotional experience becomes unforgettable. A moment of intense fear, joy, or loss is etched into memory far more strongly than neutral events. This is not accidental, it is how the system organizes importance. Emotion amplifies, and what is amplified becomes dominant. A man once attempted to change his life through sheer mental effort. Each morning he repeated phrases of success, abundance, and confidence. Yet throughout the day his emotional state remained unchanged, uncertain, tense, doubtful. Weeks passed. Nothing shifted. Frustrated, he concluded that such practices were ineffective. But the issue was not the words. It was the absence of feeling behind them, because the subconscious was not receiving a consistent signal. One evening, after a long period of reflection, he tried something different. Instead of repeating phrases mechanically, he focused on recalling a moment in his life when he had felt genuine confidence, clear, grounded, certain. He allowed himself to re-experience that state, not intellectually, emotionally. For a few minutes he inhabited that feeling fully. The shift was subtle, but real. Over the following days, he repeated the process, Not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently enough that the emotional tone began to stabilize, and with it, something else changed. His posture, his tone, his decisions. He began to act in ways that aligned with that feeling. Opportunities he would have ignored, he now engaged. Situations that once triggered hesitation, he approached differently. The external world had not suddenly transformed, but his interaction with it had, and over time the results followed. This is the principle. Feeling is not decoration, it is direction. The reason lies in how the mind organizes reality. Thoughts are numerous, often contradictory, and frequently inconsistent. But emotional states tend to dominate attention. They create coherence. When a feeling is sustained, it acts as a filter through which thoughts are selected and interpreted. Emotion organizes thought, and organized thought guides action. This is why two people can hold similar ideas but experience different outcomes. One may think about success occasionally but feel doubt most of the time. The other may think about it less frequently but feel aligned with it consistently. The second person moves differently because feeling shapes behavior more directly than thought. Ancient traditions hinted at this through various teachings, emphasizing not only right thinking, but right state, right alignment, right presence. They understood that internal atmosphere determines external engagement. A story from an old teaching tells of a musician who struggled to master a difficult instrument. He practiced tirelessly, memorizing every note, every sequence, every technical detail, yet his music lacked life. One day, an older master listened and said, "You know the notes, but you do not feel the music." Confused, the student asked how to change this. The master replied, "Stop trying to control the sound. Become the state from which the sound emerges." The student did not understand immediately, but over time he realized that technique alone was insufficient. The quality of the music depended on the state he was in while playing. When his attention shifted from control to feeling, the music changed not through force, through alignment. The same principle applies here. You do not manifest through rigid control of thought. You manifest through alignment of feeling. This does not mean forcing emotion artificially. It means gradually cultivating states that support the outcomes you seek. Calm instead of panic, clarity instead of confusion, confidence instead of doubt. Not perfectly, but consistently, because consistency creates familiarity. And familiarity becomes identity. There is also a quiet correction needed here. Some believe that feeling alone can override all reality, that simply generating a certain emotion will immediately produce desired outcomes. This is an exaggeration. Feeling does not bypass reality, it shapes your engagement with it. And through that engagement, outcomes evolve. This distinction matters because it keeps the teaching grounded, practical, applicable. The goal is not to escape reality, it is to participate in it more effectively. And feeling is the key that determines how that participation unfolds. So observe carefully. What emotional states dominate your daily experience? Not occasionally, consistently, because those states are not just responses, they are instructions. And over time, they become the atmosphere in which your life unfolds. Shift the atmosphere, and the entire experience begins to reorganize. Quickly, gradually, but unmistakably. This is the deeper layer of the code. Not just what you think, but what you feel repeatedly, because in the end, feeling is the language your inner system understands best. Chapter 7. The Ancient Error, Seeking Outside. There is a pattern so deeply woven into human behavior that it often goes unnoticed. When something feels missing, the instinct is to search outward, more effort, more movement, more acquisition. Yet this instinct, though natural, has been quietly questioned across centuries of philosophical and mystical traditions. Not because effort is useless, but because effort applied without inner alignment often produces resistance rather than results. The ancient error is not action, it is misplaced direction. A man once believed that success required constant motion. He worked longer hours, pursued more opportunities, expanded his network, and filled every moment with activity. From the outside, his life appeared driven and disciplined. But internally, something was unsettled. His decisions were guided by urgency rather than clarity. His goals shifted frequently, his attention was divided, and despite his effort, his results remained inconsistent. He assumed he needed to push harder, so he did. But the harder he pushed, the more fragmented his outcomes became. Eventually, exhaustion forced him into stillness, not by choice, but by necessity. During that period, something became visible that constant activity had concealed. He was not lacking effort, he was lacking alignment. His actions were not guided by a coherent inner state. They were reactions, responses to pressure, comparison, and fear of falling behind. And so his external movement reflected internal instability. This is the subtle mechanism behind the ancient error. When the inner state is unclear, external effort multiplies confusion, movement amplifies misdirection, and the result is often mistaken for lack of opportunity, bad timing, or external limitation, when in reality, it is a reflection of internal fragmentation. This pattern appears in many forms. A person seeks confidence by changing appearance, yet continues to carry doubt internally. The external adjustment provides temporary relief, but the underlying pattern remains. Another seeks fulfillment through relationships, believing the right person will resolve an internal sense of incompleteness. For a time, it seems to work. But eventually, the same feelings resurface because they were never addressed at their source. Another pursues wealth, believing it will create security. And while resources increase, anxiety remains unchanged because the internal structure generating that anxiety was left intact. Different paths, same pattern, outer pursuit without inner alignment. A story told among early contemplative traditions speaks of a traveler who spent years searching for water in distant lands. He crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and followed rumors of hidden springs. Each time he arrived, the water was either gone or insufficient. Exhausted, he finally collapsed near his original village. There, an old man approached and asked what he was seeking. "Water," the traveler replied. "I have searched everywhere, but I cannot find it." The old man smiled gently and pointed to the ground beneath him. "You built your house above a spring." The traveler had lived above the source all along, but had never thought to look inward. The error was not the desire for water, it was the direction of the search. This principle extends beyond metaphor into practical psychology. External action is always filtered through internal state. If the state is reactive, the action will carry that reactivity. If the state is uncertain, the action will reflect hesitation. If the state is scattered, the action will lack coherence. And over time, these subtle qualities accumulate into visible outcomes. This is why two individuals can apply similar effort and achieve very different results. One moves from clarity, the other from pressure. One responds, the other reacts. The difference is not always visible in the action itself. It is embedded in the state behind it. This is also where a common misunderstanding must be addressed. The idea that everything is internal is often taken to mean that external effort is unnecessary. This is not accurate. Action remains essential, but its effectiveness depends on the condition from which it arises. Effort guided by alignment becomes precise. Effort driven by imbalance becomes excessive. One creates progress, the other creates friction. So the question shifts, not what should I do next, but from what state am I acting? This question is rarely asked, yet it determines far more than the specific action chosen. A person who pauses long enough to examine their state often discovers something surprising. Much of what they believed required immediate action does not. Much of what felt urgent loses intensity. And from that pause, a different kind of movement becomes possible, one that is not driven by pressure, but guided by clarity. This is the beginning of correction, not abandoning action, but realigning it, because once the inner state becomes stable, external effort no longer feels like struggle, it becomes expression. And from this shift emerges a principle preserved in one of the most enduring philosophical traditions, one that speaks not of force, but of flow, a principle that redefines what it means to influence reality. Chapter 8. The Law of Alignment. There is a paradox at the heart of effective action. The more forcefully you try to control outcomes, the more resistance you often encounter. Yet when you move with a certain ease, without urgency, without strain, results seem to unfold with less friction. This paradox was explored deeply within the teachings of the Tao Te Ching, attributed to the sage Laozi. At the center of these teachings lies a concept often translated as Wu Wei. It does not mean inaction, it means non-forced action, aligned action. Action that arises naturally from a clear and balanced state, rather than from tension or compulsion. Flow outperforms force. This idea can feel counterintuitive, especially in a world that celebrates effort, urgency, and constant striving. Yet when observed carefully, it reveals itself repeatedly in lived experience. A skilled craftsman does not rush his work. His movements are deliberate, efficient, and precise. He is not forcing the material, he is working with it. A seasoned negotiator does not dominate conversation. They listen, observe, and respond at the right moment. Their influence comes not from pressure, but from timing and clarity. An experienced athlete does not perform best when tense. Peak performance occurs when the body and mind are synchronized, relaxed yet focused. In each case, the effectiveness of action depends on the state behind it. This is alignment. A river does not force its way through the landscape. It follows the path of least resistance, yet over time it shapes entire valleys. Its power lies not in aggression, but in consistency and flow. Force exhausts, flow endures. A story from Taoist tradition tells of a woodcutter who observed an old man carving intricate figures from stone. The carvings were so detailed and lifelike that they seemed almost impossible to create. When asked how he achieved such mastery, the old man replied, "I do not impose the form upon the stone. I wait until I can see the form within it, and then I remove what is unnecessary." This is Wu Wei in practice, not forcing reality to conform to will, but aligning perception and action with what is already possible. This does not mean passivity. It requires awareness, patience, sensitivity to timing, because aligned action is not the absence of movement, it is the refinement of it. A modern example can be seen in decision-making. When a person feels pressured, they tend to rush. Decisions are made quickly, often without full clarity. The result may be immediate relief, but long-term consequences often follow. In contrast, when a person pauses, when they allow the initial surge of emotion to settle, something changes. They begin to see more options. They notice details previously overlooked. Their response becomes measured rather than reactive. The action that follows is often simpler, yet more effective, because it is aligned. This is not coincidence. It is the result of a different internal condition. And that condition determines the quality of interaction with reality. There is also a subtle correction needed here. Alignment is not the same as comfort. Sometimes aligned action requires difficulty, confrontation, change, or stepping into uncertainty. But even in these moments, the action arises from clarity rather than compulsion. The difference is felt internally. One carries tension, the other carries steadiness. And that steadiness changes how the action unfolds. A man once faced a critical decision that could alter the course of his career. For weeks he tried to force a conclusion. He analyzed every variable, sought advice from multiple sources, and attempted to predict every possible outcome. The more he pushed, the more uncertain he became. Finally, he stepped away from the problem entirely. He gave himself time, walking, reflecting, allowing the urgency to settle. After several days, the answer became clear, not through additional analysis, but through a shift in perspective. When he acted, the decision felt direct, not easy, but certain, and the process that followed, though complex, unfolded with far less resistance than he had expected. This is the effect of alignment. It does not eliminate challenge, it reduces unnecessary friction. Because the action is no longer fighting against internal conflict, it is supported by coherence. This principle connects directly to everything explored so far. Belief shapes internal patterns. Feeling reinforces those patterns, and alignment determines how those patterns are expressed through action. When these elements are in conflict, effort increases while effectiveness decreases. When they are coherent, even simple actions produce meaningful results. This is why ancient teachings often emphasized stillness, not as an escape but as preparation. Because in stillness, alignment can be recognized. In noise, it is easily lost, so the practice becomes clear. Pause before acting. Observe the state from which the action is arising. If it is driven by urgency, fear, or pressure, allow it to settle, not by suppressing it, but by giving it space. Then act from clarity, even if the action is small, because small, aligned actions accumulate, and over time they reshape experience. This is the law of alignment, not mystical, not abstract, but observable. When you stop forcing reality, you begin working with it. And when that shift occurs, effort transforms into precision. Chapter 9. The Pattern of Thought Repetition. There is a rhythm to the mind that few notice, yet it governs much of life. Thoughts do not pass once and disappear. They return, they repeat, they reinforce. And through repetition, they become something else entirely. They become patterns. At first, a thought feels like a choice, a reaction, a passing interpretation of an event. But when the same thought appears again and again, unchallenged, uninterrupted, it begins to lose its identity as a thought and takes on the authority of truth. Repetition becomes reality. This is not metaphor, it is conditioning. Ancient traditions understood this through different language, but the insight was consistent. Whether in Stoic reflection, Buddhist observation, or Hermetic teaching, the emphasis remained the same. What is repeated internally becomes the structure through which life is experienced. A man once described his life as unlucky. It was not something he concluded after careful analysis. It was something he had said casually for years. "I've never been lucky." He said it after small inconveniences, after missed opportunities, after minor setbacks. At first, it was harmless, then it became habitual. Over time it became identity, and once it became identity, it began shaping behavior. He stopped taking certain risks because it probably won't work anyway. He overlooked possibilities because things like that don't happen to me. He interpreted neutral events as negative confirmations. His life did not suddenly become unlucky. It became organized around that assumption. The thought had repeated long enough to become a program. This is how repetition operates, not dramatically, not instantly, but steadily. A single drop of water does not carve stone. But repeated over time, it reshapes entire surfaces. The force is not in intensity, it is in consistency. The same principle applies to thought. The mind is constantly forming pathways, associations that become easier to access the more they are used. What is repeated becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes default, and what becomes default guides behavior without conscious effort. This is why many people feel as though they are living on autopilot, because in many ways they are not controlled by fate, but guided by patterns they no longer question. A woman once carried a quiet internal phrase, "I'm not the kind of person who succeeds at this." She did not say it aloud. She did not consciously defend it, but it appeared whenever she approached something new. When she considered applying for a better position, the thought appeared. When she thought about learning a new skill, it appeared again. When she imagined a different life, it surfaced immediately. Each time, it shaped her response. She hesitated, delayed, sometimes avoided action altogether. Years passed. Her circumstances remained largely unchanged, and the thought continued, now reinforced by the evidence her own behavior had created. This is the loop of repetition. Thought shapes action. Action shapes result. Result reinforces thought, a closed system. But here is the crucial point. The system continues not because it is true, but because it is repeated. This distinction is essential because it means that what feels inevitable is often simply familiar, and what is familiar can be changed, not by force, but by introducing a different pattern, a conscious one. At first, this feels unnatural, even artificial, because the new thought does not yet have the weight of repetition behind it. It lacks familiarity. It does not feel true in the same way. But truth in this context is often just the echo of repetition. So the process begins. A new thought is introduced, repeated intentionally, supported with attention, reinforced through action. At first, it competes with the old pattern. Then gradually it begins to coexist, and over time, if sustained, it becomes dominant. A man who once believed he was incapable of discipline began with a simple shift, not a grand declaration, but a small internal statement. I can follow through on small things. He did not try to transform everything at once. He repeated the thought quietly, daily, and he acted on it in small ways, keeping minor commitments, completing simple tasks, following through where he previously would have abandoned effort. The repetition began to take hold. The thought felt less foreign. The behavior became more consistent. And eventually, the identity began to shift, not suddenly, but undeniably. He did not become a different person overnight. He became a different pattern. This is the deeper truth. You are not fixed, you are patterned. And patterns can be rewritten, but only through repetition. This is also where a necessary correction must be made. Some interpret this idea to mean that all repetition is beneficial if it is positive. But repetition without alignment can create conflict. Repeating a statement that is too far removed from your current experience can create internal resistance. The system rejects what feels implausible. So the key is not exaggeration, it is progression. Introduce thoughts that stretch the current pattern, But do not break coherence. From I always fail to I can improve. From nothing works for me to some things are working. From I'm not capable to I am learning capability. These shifts may seem small, but small shifts repeated become structural, and structure determines outcome. This is the pattern of thought repetition. It is always operating. The only question is whether it is operating consciously or unconsciously. Because if left unobserved, it will continue shaping reality without your participation. But if recognized, it becomes a tool, and once this tool is understood, another principle emerges. One that goes beyond repetition and into something more subtle, yet equally powerful. Not just what you repeat, but what you assume. Chapter 10, The Power of Assumption. There is a difference between thinking something and assuming it. A thought may come and go. An assumption remains. It sits beneath the surface, quietly organizing perception, guiding interpretation, and shaping behavior without needing to be repeated constantly. Assumption directs reality. This principle was explored deeply by Neville Goddard, who emphasized that what you consistently assume to be true about yourself, about others, about life, becomes the lens through which all experience is filtered, and once filtered, it becomes lived. An assumption does not need to be spoken, it does not need to be justified. It simply needs to be held, and from that holding it begins to influence everything. A man once assumed that people did not respect him. It was not based on a single event, but on a pattern he had internalized over time. Because of this assumption, he entered conversations with subtle defensiveness. His tone carried tension. His posture reflected uncertainty. He anticipated dismissal before it occurred, and others responded accordingly, not because they had decided to disrespect him, but because his behavior, shaped by assumption, influenced the interaction. Over time, his experience confirmed the assumption. They never take me seriously. But what he did not see was how the assumption had guided the process from the beginning. This is the quiet power of assumption. It does not wait for evidence, it creates interpretation. And interpretation shapes response. A woman once assumed that new opportunities would be overwhelming. Whenever something unfamiliar appeared, she felt immediate pressure. Because of this, she approached new situations cautiously, sometimes withdrawing before fully engaging. Her experience became one of limitation, not because opportunity was absent, but because her assumption had framed it as a threat rather than possibility. This is how assumption reorganizes reality. It determines what is noticed, what is ignored, what is emphasized, and what is dismissed. Two people can walk into the same room and experience entirely different environments, not because the room changed, but because their assumptions filtered what they perceived. One notices opportunity, the other notices risk. One sees openness, the other sees judgment. The external remains constant, the internal interpretation differs, and from that difference, two separate realities emerge. This is not mystical exaggeration, it is psychological structure. Assumption acts as a blueprint, and behavior follows blueprint. This is why assumption is often more powerful than isolated thought. A thought may be repeated and eventually fade. An assumption, however, remains active until consciously examined. It operates quietly, consistently, and often invisibly. A story from an old teaching speaks of a man who believed that every path he chose would lead to failure. Because of this, he hesitated at every crossroads, second-guessed every decision, and rarely committed fully to any direction. Years later, he looked back and saw a pattern of incomplete efforts and missed opportunities. His conclusion was simple. Every path fails, but the truth was different. His assumption had prevented him from walking any path long enough for success to emerge. The assumption shaped the outcome, not the path itself. This is why examining assumptions becomes essential. Not all assumptions are obvious. Some are subtle, deeply ingrained, carried from early experiences, cultural conditioning, or repeated interpretations of past events. But once seen, they can be adjusted, and this is where the process becomes practical. First, observe recurring experiences. Where do similar outcomes appear again and again? Then ask, what must I be assuming for this to feel consistent? The answer may not appear immediately, but with attention, patterns reveal themselves. Once identified, the assumption can be questioned, not rejected forcefully, but examined. Is it always true? Is it universally valid? Or is it simply familiar? This questioning creates space, and within that space, a new assumption can be introduced, not exaggerated, not unrealistic, but slightly expanded. A person who assumes nothing works out for me might begin with some things can work out. A person who assumes people don't listen to me might shift to some people are open to hearing me. These changes are subtle, but they are powerful, because assumption does not require repetition in the same way thought does. Once accepted, it becomes the new baseline, and from that baseline, perception begins to reorganize. New details are noticed, different choices are made, behavior shifts, and over time, outcomes reflect the change. This is not instant transformation, it is gradual reorganization, but it is reliable. Because the system follows the assumption it is given, this is the deeper layer of the code. Not just what you think repeatedly, but what you accept as given, because what is assumed becomes invisible. And what is invisible becomes powerful, so the practice becomes clear. Bring assumptions into awareness, examine them, refine them, and allow new ones to take root. Because once the underlying assumption changes, reality reorganizes around it. Chapter 11, The Illusion of Limitation. Consider this. How many of your limits were never tested, only inherited? In the quiet halls of ancient mystery schools, initiates were first taught not how to gain power, but how to question what they believed was impossible. A young student once approached his master, insisting he lacked the ability to rise beyond his station. The master handed him a sealed box and said, "Open it." The student struggled, pushed, forced, until he gave up. Hours later, the master returned, gently lifted the lid, and revealed it had never been locked. The barrier was assumed, not real. Limitations often wear the disguise of certainty. They arrive through family language, cultural expectations, early failures, then settle into identity. Over time, they feel unquestionable. But ancient thinkers, from Hermetic teachers to early Gnostic circles, warned that most boundaries exist first as belief structures, not physical facts. The mind draws a line, and then obeys it. What makes this dangerous is subtle. Once a belief is accepted, perception begins to filter reality to confirm it. Opportunities go unnoticed. Possibilities feel unrealistic. You don't just live within limits. You begin to see only what fits them. The prison becomes invisible. A merchant in Alexandria once believed prosperity was reserved for the privileged. Though he worked tirelessly, he avoided bold opportunities, dismissed new ventures, and hesitated at every risk. Another man, with fewer resources but a different belief, saw the same marketplace as abundant. Years later, their outcomes reflected not effort but expectation. This is the silent mechanism. Belief defines the edges of your perceived world. Two people stand in the same reality, yet inhabit entirely different versions of it. Same world, different boundaries. Ancient texts hint at this again and again, not as mysticism but as observation. The hidden chains are internal agreements, often formed unconsciously and reinforced daily, and because they feel like truth, they are rarely questioned. Break the agreement, and the boundary weakens. There is a moment, quiet but powerful, when you begin to suspect that what you thought was fixed might be flexible. That moment changes everything, because once doubt enters a limiting belief, it begins to dissolve. A short truth remains. Limits are learned, not absolute. Your task is not to force reality to expand. It is to examine what you have accepted as fixed and gently question its validity. Look for the edges of your assumptions. Challenge them with evidence, experience, and awareness. What you question, you loosen. What you loosen, you outgrow. That's the shift. Chapter 12, The Role of Gratitude. What if one of the oldest secrets was not about gaining more, but seeing differently? Across civilizations, from early philosophical writings to modern psychological studies, a quiet principle repeats. Gratitude reshapes perception before it reshapes reality. A traveler once visited a remote village, known not for its wealth, but for its peace. Curious, he asked an elder, "Why do you live without fear of lack?" The elder smiled and replied, "Because we begin each day by recognizing what already exists." The traveler laughed at first, until he realized that in this place people moved with certainty, acted with openness, and rarely hesitated. They behaved as if life was supportive, and so it appeared that way. Gratitude is often misunderstood as politeness or positivity, but ancient teaching suggests something deeper. It is a recalibration of attention. When you consistently acknowledge what is working, present, or sufficient, your mind begins to prioritize similar patterns. Not magically, but psychologically and behaviorally. This shift is powerful, because the mind does not operate on objective reality. It operates on what it repeatedly notices and reinforces. Gratitude changes that filter. It trains perception to detect opportunity instead of absence, progress instead of lack. Modern thinkers like Joseph Murphy and Neville Goddard echoed this principle in different language. They suggested that gratitude aligns the subconscious with a state of having rather than wanting, and the subconscious, in turn, organizes behavior, decisions, and focus accordingly. Here is the quiet truth. A mind trained to see abundance behaves differently than one trained to see scarcity. One takes action. The other hesitates. One expects possibility. The other prepares for limitation. Two minds, two outcomes. There is no need for exaggeration here. Gratitude does not instantly transform circumstances, but it transforms the way you engage with them, and that changes what follows. A businessman facing repeated setbacks once began a simple practice. Each evening, he listed 3 things that had gone right, no matter how small. At first, it felt forced, but within weeks he noticed a shift. He became less reactive, more observant, more willing to act. Opportunities that once seemed invisible became obvious, not because they suddenly appeared, but because his attention had changed. This is the overlooked mechanism. Gratitude conditions the mind to recognize and utilize what is already present. A short truth remains. Attention follows appreciation. If you want to apply this, begin without complexity. At the end of each day, identify what worked, what supported you, what moved forward even slightly. Do not dramatize, simply observe. What you consistently acknowledge, you strengthen. What you strengthen, you expand. Chapter 13, The Subtle Influence of Language. There was an ancient teaching preserved in fragments of Hermetic schools that said the world is not shaped by hands first, but by articulation. Before stone becomes temple, Before thought becomes action, there is a quieter force at work, language forming the architecture of identity itself. The elders did not treat words as decoration of thought. They treated them as instruction codes for consciousness. In one overlooked tradition, scribes in training were forbidden to speak casually about themselves for a full cycle of the moon. Not as punishment, but as calibration. They were taught that every repeated phrase becomes a subtle imprint in the subconscious field, slowly shaping perception until it feels like truth rather than repetition. A young initiate once described it simply, "I did not realize I was building a self with every sentence I spoke." Modern psychology, though stripped of mysticism, echoes this same principle. Internal dialogue is not neutral, it is programming. The mind does not distinguish easily between observation and instruction when repetition is involved. A phrase like "I always fail at this" is not a description. It is a directive reinforced over time. The subconscious, much like an obedient but literal servant, begins organizing perception to confirm it. Ancient Stoics approached this differently, but arrived at the same core insight. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes colored by its thoughts. But what is less often emphasized is that thoughts are often shaped by language first. What you repeatedly say becomes what you repeatedly notice. What you repeatedly notice becomes what you believe is reality. This is not philosophy alone, it is cognitive formation. There is a forgotten parable from a desert teaching circle where two travelers were given identical journeys across harsh terrain. One repeatedly spoke of exhaustion, danger, and scarcity. The other spoke only of endurance, passage, and completion. They walked the same path under the same sun, yet their experiences diverged so dramatically that they later described entirely different worlds. The desert did not change. Their language did. This is the hidden influence. Language acts as a filter before perception even fully forms. It does not simply describe reality after the fact. It frames reality before experience solidifies. Neurologically, this is reflected in how attention networks prioritize information that matches internal labeling. Psychologically, it is reflected in confirmation bias. Spiritually, ancient traditions interpreted it as vibration-shaping manifestation. In Hermetic thought, speech was considered a bridge between invisible thought and visible form, not metaphorically, but structurally. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks of mind as the origin of all form, and language as the first condensation of that origin into structure. In this framework, words are not passive, they are early-stage reality. This is why certain traditions placed immense discipline around speech. Not because words are dangerous in themselves, but because careless repetition becomes unconscious identity. A person who repeatedly says, "I am unlucky," begins to unconsciously reject opportunities that contradict that identity. Not through fate, but through perception narrowing. The subtle influence lies in this narrowing. Language does not just express who you are, it defines the perimeter of what you can easily perceive as possible. Over time, this becomes invisible. The mind no longer sees it as a belief. It experiences it as just how things are. Yet ancient wisdom consistently points to a corrective mechanism, interruption of language patterns. Silence before speech was not merely restraint. It was a method of breaking automatic identity construction. By pausing, awareness returns to choice, and in that space, language becomes deliberate again rather than inherited. A modern equivalent can be observed in cognitive behavioral practices where reframing internal dialogue changes emotional and behavioral outcomes. But ancient traditions went deeper. They understood that language does not only change behavior, It changes the observer behind behavior. This is the deeper truth hidden inside the influence of words. You do not simply speak language. Language over time speaks you into being. Chapter 14, The Collapse of Resistance. In Taoist teachings, there is a principle so simple it is often misunderstood. What is forced becomes unstable. What is aligned becomes effortless. Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, is not passivity. It is action without internal contradiction. It is movement without resistance inside the mover. There is an old story attributed to river monks who observed two farmers during a prolonged drought. One farmer dug aggressively, forcing channels through hardened soil, exhausting himself under the belief that effort alone would summon water. The other farmer studied the land, followed natural depressions, and guided water where it already wanted to flow. When rain eventually came, the first farmer's channels collapsed under strain. The second farmer's system expanded naturally. The difference was not effort. It was resistance. Resistance, in psychological terms, is internal opposition to what is currently present. It is the mental friction between what is and what should be. Most people assume resistance is necessary for change. Ancient systems suggest the opposite. Resistance delays integration. It prolongs the gap between intention and manifestation. Stoic philosophy touches this indirectly. Marcus Aurelius observed that suffering arises not from events, but from resistance to interpretation. When the mind argues with reality, it creates internal tension. That tension does not alter external conditions, it only distorts perception and drains clarity. Modern neuroscience adds another layer. When the nervous system perceives sustained resistance, it activates stress responses that narrow cognitive flexibility. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than strategic. In this state, behavior becomes repetitive rather than adaptive. What feels like trying harder is often just repeating the same pattern with more intensity. Ancient Taoist insight would describe this as misalignment with flow. The system is moving in one direction while consciousness attempts to force another. The result is not transformation, but friction. But collapse of resistance does not mean collapse of action. It means the removal of inner contradiction during action. A warrior still moves, a builder still constructs. But internally, there is no argument against what is already unfolding. This creates a paradox. Less resistance produces more effective influence. There is a subtle psychological shift that occurs when resistance dissolves. Attention broadens. Perception becomes less filtered by fear-based projection. Options that were previously invisible become obvious. Not because reality changes, but because interpretation stops obstructing it. In mystical traditions, this state is often described as returning to natural order. In Hermetic language, it is alignment with underlying law. In psychological language, it is reduced cognitive dissonance. Different frameworks, same mechanism. The removal of internal opposition reveals a clearer field of action. A quiet parable speaks of a student who constantly struggled to fix his life through intense effort. His teacher gave him a single instruction: stop arguing with your present moment for one day. Not acceptance as resignation, but observation without internal rejection. By evening, the student noticed something unexpected. Solutions that had felt distant became immediately visible once his internal resistance stopped filtering his perception. This is the collapse that changes everything. Not the collapse of effort, but the collapse of friction within effort. When resistance dissolves, action becomes cleaner, timing becomes intuitive, and decisions require less force because less internal contradiction exists to overcome. The deepest misunderstanding is assuming resistance is protective. In reality, it is often obstructive memory repeating itself as caution. Once observed, it loses authority. Once released, energy previously spent on internal opposition becomes available for coherent direction. Chapter 15. The Discipline of Attention. In the hidden schools of the ancient world, attention was never treated as a casual function of the mind. It was considered the most valuable force a human possesses. In the Hermetic traditions of Alexandria, students were taught a simple but unsettling truth. Whatever governs your attention governs your life, not as metaphor but as mechanism. The mind does not experience reality evenly. It amplifies whatever it repeatedly observes. The ancient initiates called this the binding of consciousness, the slow formation of identity through what one refuses to stop noticing. There is a story preserved in fragments from early philosophical circles of a young student who sought wisdom from a desert sage. The student complained that his life was scattered, his thoughts unstable, his outcomes unpredictable. The sage led him to a barren field and placed a stone in his hand. "Hold this," the sage said, "and do not drop it until I return." Hours passed. The student's attention narrowed until the stone became heavy, then unbearable. When the sage returned, he asked what the student had experienced. "Only the stone," the student replied. The sage nodded. "That is your life. What you hold in attention becomes your world." Modern neuroscience now echoes this ancient insight. Attention strengthens neural pathways, making repeated focus easier and more automatic over time. But the ancients framed it differently. Attention is not just neurological, it is creative selection. What you repeatedly focus on becomes the architecture of your perception, and perception becomes the boundary of your possible actions. In this way, attention does not merely reflect reality, it organizes it. The Stoics understood this with surgical clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind becomes what it repeatedly looks at. If it looks at chaos, it becomes chaotic. If it looks at clarity, it becomes ordered. This was not moral instruction, it was psychological engineering. To control attention was to control fate, because fate is nothing more than repeated patterns of response. A merchant in ancient coastal trade routes once noticed a strange pattern. Two sailors, exposed to identical storms, returned with entirely different outcomes. One always saw danger first, reacting impulsively and exhausting himself in panic. The other scanned the same horizon but focused on navigation cues, wind shifts and timing. The sea did not change, attention did. And that difference shaped survival, fortune and reputation. The same principle operates in modern life, though disguised. The mind that focuses on lack reinforces lack, not because reality punishes it, but because perception filters opportunities accordingly. A person fixated on failure will unconsciously ignore signals of success. A person anchored in possibility will overlook fewer openings. Nothing external has changed. Attention has. The ancient Pythagoreans hinted at this through their doctrine of harmony. They believed reality responds to proportion and focus, not force. To them, attention was like tuning a string. Tighten it toward fear and the tone becomes brittle. Align it toward clarity and it produces coherence. Life, they believed, responds like music. What you consistently tune into becomes your lived frequency. But attention is not only about what you choose, it is also about what chooses you. Most people assume they control their focus, yet the opposite is often true. Habits, emotions, and environmental cues continuously hijack attention without permission. The mind drifts not randomly but predictably toward what has been emotionally reinforced in the past. This is where discipline enters, not as restriction, but as reclamation. To discipline attention is to withdraw it from unconscious automation and return it to conscious direction. The ancient training methods reflected this. Long periods of observation, silence, repetition of focused inquiry, not because silence itself was sacred, but because it revealed where attention had been leaking. A modern parallel can be found in high-performance training environments, where athletes are taught to return focus instantly after distraction. The goal is not perfection, but recovery speed. Every return strengthens neural stability. Every moment of redirected attention reshapes internal wiring. The Hermetic text warned that scattered attention fragments consciousness, while unified attention concentrates creative force. When attention is divided, outcomes are diluted. When attention is unified, even ordinary actions gain unusual precision. This is why ancient initiates emphasized still focus over constant effort. Effort without attention is dispersion. Attention without effort is alignment. There is also a subtle emotional dimension. What you attend to repeatedly begins to feel more real, regardless of its objective importance. Fear grows not because it is powerful, but because it is frequently observed internally. The same applies to confidence, gratitude, and clarity. Attention feeds emotional tone, and emotional tone feeds behavioral momentum. A quiet principle emerges here. You do not rise to the level of your intentions, but to the level of your sustained attention. And yet, there is a paradox the ancients understood well. Attention cannot be controlled through force alone. The more violently one tries to control it, the more it resists. Instead, they taught redirection through awareness. Notice where attention goes without judgment and gently return it. Over time, the mind begins to reorganize itself. The Taoist masters compared this to water shaping stone, not through pressure, but persistence. Attention, when gently disciplined, carves pathways through perception. Eventually, those pathways become default reality filters. The emerging insight across traditions is remarkably consistent. Attention is not passive observation, it is active creation. What you consistently notice becomes what your mind believes is important. What your mind believes is important becomes what you act upon, and what you act upon becomes the architecture of your life, set up for continuation. If attention is the architect of experience, then silence becomes the space where the architect is finally seen. Chapter 16, The Power of Inner Stillness. In the forgotten contemplative traditions of both East and West, stillness was never considered emptiness. It was considered the first condition of accurate perception. The Upanishadic sages described it as the moment consciousness stops chasing its own reflections. The Stoics called it inner citadel quiet. Even the Hermetic practitioners treated silence as the gateway through which distorted perception dissolves. There is an ancient account of a philosopher who withdrew from public life after years of debate and argument. When asked why he abandoned discourse, he said something deceptively simple: "I could not hear reality over my own interpretations." That sentence carries the essence of stillness, not withdrawal from the world, but withdrawal from internal noise that distorts the world. Stillness is not the absence of thought, it is the absence of compulsion. Thoughts may arise, but they no longer dominate. In this space, something subtle becomes visible, the patterns beneath reaction. Most people never perceive these patterns because their awareness is constantly entangled in responding rather than observing. The Tao Te Ching expresses this principle indirectly through Wu Wei, effortless action. But the deeper implication is often missed. Effortless action arises only after inner noise settles. When the mind is agitated, every decision becomes reactive. When the mind is still, perception becomes precise, and action becomes naturally aligned. Modern psychology aligns with this ancient understanding in unexpected ways. Cognitive research shows that when mental activity slows, the brain becomes better at integrating information rather than fragmenting it. In stillness, patterns previously hidden by emotional reactivity become observable. This is not mystical, it is structural. Noise suppresses pattern recognition, silence restores it. An old Zen parable describes a student who asked his teacher how enlightenment is achieved. The teacher replied, "Sit, do nothing." The student protested that this was too simple. The teacher responded, "You are already doing too much inside." The point was not in activity, but the removal of interference. Stillness is not added, it is uncovered. In lived experience, this principle is often revealed during moments of crisis. When external chaos forces internal silence, perception sharpens. People often report sudden clarity in emergencies, not because intelligence increases, but because noise decreases. The same clarity can be cultivated deliberately, without crisis, through disciplined stillness. A merchant in ancient trading cities once described how he made his most accurate decisions not during active negotiation but in the quiet moments before speaking. "When I stop trying to win," he said, "I finally see what is actually happening." This is the essence of stillness applied to action. Clarity precedes effectiveness. Stillness also interrupts the momentum of inherited patterns. Most behaviors are not chosen in the moment, they are activated from stored responses. Without stillness, these responses operate invisibly. With stillness, there is a gap, a pause where choice becomes possible again. That gap is where transformation begins. The corpus hermeticum refers to this state as alignment with nous, the higher intellect. It is not achieved through accumulation of knowledge, but through the removal of distortion. Stillness strips perception down to essential signal, reducing noise until meaning becomes self-evident. There is a subtle psychological shift that occurs here. When stillness deepens, identity begins to loosen its grip. Many of the narratives that normally define self are revealed as repetitive thought structures rather than fixed truth. This realization can be unsettling at first, but it creates space for more accurate perception. The practical application is deceptively simple. Moments of intentional stillness, before reacting, before deciding, before speaking, begin to restructure internal architecture. Over time, the mind stops defaulting to automatic patterns and starts responding from awareness. This shift does not eliminate thought, it refines it. The ancient Stoics practiced a form of this through daily reflection. They would withdraw from external input and examine their reactions without judgment. This was not moral accounting, it was perceptual calibration. They understood that without stillness, perception becomes biased towards survival instincts rather than truth. The emerging principle across traditions is clear. Attention creates structure, but stillness reveals structure. One builds the experience, the other exposes its architecture, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. Stom for continuation. When attention becomes disciplined and stillness becomes natural, perception no longer reacts to life, it begins to recognize its own role in shaping it. Chapter 17, The Return to Creative Authority. There is a moment in every tradition of hidden knowledge when the seeker is no longer instructed to learn more, but to remember something that was never lost, only overlooked. The ancient Hermetic schools called this the return of authorship. Not authorship over the world itself, but over the meaning through which the world is experienced. Because long before action shapes outcome, perception has already shaped interpretation. And interpretation silently determines what is even possible. In one preserved fragment of a forgotten teaching circle near the late Alexandrian period, a student asked a question that seemed simple. If reality is governed by unseen laws, where is my place in it? The teacher did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed a mirror in front of the student and said, "What do you see?" The student replied, "My reflection." The teacher nodded and said, "And yet you believe the reflection is the one looking." That exchange contains the essence of creative authority. Most people experience life as if they are the reflection, moved, shaped, and altered by external forces. But the ancient insight reverses this assumption. You are not the reflection reacting to the world. You are the awareness through which the reflection appears. And that subtle reversal changes everything. The Stoics approached this realization through disciplined perception. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the idea that the mind is not what happens to it, but how it frames what happens. The external world does not directly generate suffering or peace, interpretation does. Two individuals can face the same event, yet inhabit entirely different realities within it. One collapses into resistance, the other reorganizes meaning and continues forward. The difference is not circumstance, it is authorship of interpretation. A merchant, once traveling through harsh desert trade routes, experienced a sandstorm that destroyed much of his caravan. Among his companions, reactions split instantly. Some saw ruin, others saw interruption, a few saw redirection. The storm was identical, yet the reality it produced fractured into multiple worlds. Later, the merchant reflected not on the storm itself, but on how quickly perception became destiny. "The wind did not decide our fate," he wrote. "Our interpretation did." This is where ancient teachings begin to converge across cultures. In the Hermetic view, consciousness is not a passive receiver of experience, but an active participant in its formation. The mind does not simply observe reality, it organizes it into recognizable structure. What you assume is happening becomes the framework through which further events are understood. In this sense, reality is continuously co-authored. The Gospel of Thomas preserves a similar tone in its hidden sayings tradition, where the emphasis is placed not on external salvation, but internal recognition. The kingdom is not arriving later, it is already structured within perception itself. This implies a radical idea. What changes your life is not new reality, but new recognition of what is already present. Psychologically, this aligns with what modern science calls predictive processing. The brain is constantly generating models of reality, then updating them based on feedback. But the model often leads perception more than perception leads the model. In other words, what you believe you are seeing shapes what you actually register. The ancient initiates did not describe this in neurological terms, but in symbolic language. The world reflects the state of the perceiver, not because the world is illusion, but because perception is selective. You notice what matches your internal structure and overlook what does not. A story from early Neoplatonic circles tells of a student who believed enlightenment meant escaping influence, becoming untouched by events. His teacher corrected him, "You cannot escape influence, you can only choose your participation." The student struggled with this until the teacher added, "Even refusal is participation." That realization marked a shift. Authority was not withdrawal from reality, but conscious engagement within it. This is the return of creative authority. Not domination over circumstances, but awareness of one's role in shaping experiential structure. Once this is seen clearly, the idea of being a passive recipient of life begins to dissolve. Even suffering changes form under this lens. Instead of being interpreted as meaningless force, it becomes information, feedback about internal structure. Resistance becomes visible not as enemy, but as signal. This does not remove difficulty, but it transforms relationship to difficulty. And in ancient wisdom traditions, relationship is everything. The Taoist perspective reinforces this subtly. When Laozi speaks of alignment with the Tao, he is not suggesting control over outcomes, but removal of internal distortion so that perception reflects reality more clearly. When perception is aligned, action becomes naturally effective, not because force increases, but because misalignment decreases. A craftsman in an old village once described this principle in practical terms. When his hands were tense, every carving tool slipped. When his mind was calm, even difficult wood yielded smoothly. The material did not change. His relationship to it did. That difference became the foundation of mastery. The same applies to experience itself. Life does not become easier through resistance. It becomes clearer through alignment. And yet, there is a deeper layer to this return. Creative authority is not something newly acquired. It is something uncovered beneath habitual reactivity. Most people are already participating in shaping their experience. They simply do so unconsciously. Thoughts, expectations, emotional tones, and repeated interpretations continuously sculpt perception without deliberate awareness. To return to authority is to become aware of what was already occurring. This awareness is often subtle at first. It appears as a pause between stimulus and reaction. In that pause, something profound becomes visible. Choice. Not the choice of external events, but the choice of meaning assigned to them. And meaning, once assigned consciously, begins to reorganize future perception. Over time, this shifts the entire architecture of experience. Instead of being pulled through reactive loops, awareness begins to stabilize. Instead of being defined by immediate interpretation, perception becomes spacious enough to include alternatives. This is where ancient teachings converge again. Freedom is not escape from conditions, but clarity within them. The return of creative authority is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost imperceptible at first, but its effects accumulate. A different tone of thought emerges. A different quality of attention forms. A different relationship to uncertainty develops. And slowly, the sense of being controlled by life begins to dissolve. What remains is not control, but participation. And participation, when conscious, becomes power. Chapter 18, Integration of the Ancient Code. In the deepest strata of the ancient philosophical traditions, mastery was never defined as domination over reality, but as harmony with its underlying structure. The Hermetic initiates did not seek to overpower natural law, they sought to align with it so precisely that resistance dissolved. The Taoists expressed the same truth differently. The sage does not force the river to change direction, but learns to move with it so completely that movement itself becomes effortless. Integration is the point where fragmented understanding becomes lived coherence. Before this stage, knowledge exists as separate insights, ideas about perception, consciousness, alignment, attention. But at integration, these are no longer concepts. They become operating conditions of experience. A story attributed to early mystery schools describes an elder teacher watching a student struggle for years with techniques of manifestation and control. The student studied laws, practiced visualization, attempted discipline over thought, yet his life remained inconsistent. One day, exhausted, he asked the teacher, "What am I missing?" the teacher replied. "You are still trying to control what only responds to coherence." The student did not understand at first, so the teacher added, "The river does not listen to commands, it listens to shape." That distinction is the essence of integration. Modern psychology echoes this principle in a different language. Cognitive behavioral systems show that stable internal patterns predict stable external outcomes. When internal states are fragmented, contradictory beliefs, unstable emotional signals, inconsistent expectations, behavior becomes erratic. But when internal structure stabilizes, behavior becomes naturally consistent without force. Ancient wisdom framed this more poetically. The Upanishadic tradition described it as coherence between inner being and outer expression. Stoicism described it as living in accordance with nature. Hermeticism described it as correspondence between levels of reality. Different languages, same architecture. Internal alignment produces external harmony, but integration is not suppression of contradiction. It is resolution of contradiction through awareness. Many people attempt to control outcomes by tightening effort, focusing harder, forcing discipline. Yet force often indicates fragmentation, not mastery. The more divided the inner system, the more effort is required to maintain external stability. True integration feels different. It is not rigid, it is stable without tension. A craftsman analogy appears again in many traditions. A master artisan does not constantly adjust force while working. His movements are minimal, precise, and adaptive. The tool becomes an extension of awareness rather than an object being controlled. In the same way, when internal alignment stabilizes, action ceases to feel like struggle and begins to feel like extension. The Hermetic texts describe this as returning to correspondence. When inner state and outer engagement are no longer in conflict, experience begins to self-organize. Opportunities appear more clearly, not because they increase, but because perception no longer filters them out. Decisions become simpler because internal contradiction is reduced. This is also where misunderstanding often arises. Integration is not passive resignation. It is not abandoning influence. It is refining influence through coherence. Action still occurs, but it emerges from clarity rather than tension. The Tao Te Ching captures this paradox in its most refined form. The highest action appears effortless because it is unforced alignment with conditions. Effortlessness is not absence of action, it is absence of internal resistance. And so the ancient code is not a set of techniques, but a sequence of realizations. Attention shapes perception, perception shapes meaning. Meaning shapes behavior, behavior shapes outcomes, and all of it stabilizes when inner state becomes coherent. Integration happens when this chain is no longer intellectual, but lived. At this stage, the seeker realizes something quietly profound. There was never a separate system to master. There was only alignment to restore. The chaos was never external, it was fragmented interpretation. And the clarity was never missing, it was simply unrecognized beneath noise. When inner state stabilizes, reality does not obey in a dramatic sense. It responds naturally, like water finding its level. Outcomes begin to feel less like pursuit and more like unfolding. The world does not become controlled, it becomes intelligible, and in that intelligibility, effort transforms into coherence. That is the final threshold the ancient traditions pointed toward. Not control of reality, but unity with its structure. The ancient texts never promised magic, they revealed responsibility. The power was never hidden from you, only hidden within you. And once you begin to see this clearly, the question is no longer if reality can change, but whether you are ready to change the one who perceives it.